I'm delighted to be here with you all, and today I'm going to discuss a subject very close to my heart, which is entanglement and the entanglement between art and science. The title of my talk today is called Disentangling Towards an Ecology of Being. As Christo probably said, I founded the Arts at CERN program at the world's largest particle physics laboratory with the world's largest machine, the Large Hadron Collider, because I thought there's nothing more incredible than colliding different knowledge systems together, those of artists and those of scientists, and seeing what happens in the process of two worlds discovering each other, even though they're very linked as well, because both are all about how we are in this world and why we exist, but they express it in different ways. And the collider, as you know, and the detectors on it are very extraordinary and kind of feats of human imagination as well as engineering. And I think it's important to emphasize that science has imagination as well as art, and that's becoming more and more recognized. Out of the program came, even in the first 2-3 years, extraordinary things. On the left, you can see Iris van Herpen. So CERN went on the catwalks of Paris in 2014, inspired by the magnets. There was a prize-winning opera called Symmetry, which won about 10 different prizes. It was a film opera by Ruben van Leer. And on the right, you can also see the dance piece by Gilles Jobin called Quantum, which was danced for the first time above where the Higgs boson was discovered and was inspired by quantum physics at CERN. But what also inspires me is Mary Shelley, who I think is so extraordinary. As a 17-year-old, she told the story of Frankenstein. And what inspires me about her is the way she brought the knowledge systems which were current at that time to discuss what it means to be living and what life is and what humanity is through the figure of the monster. So she incorporated galvanism, which was all about whether electricity was the spark of life, for example, as well as other deeper philosophical ideas, and just as a 17-year-old. So in a way, this shows how art and science are deeply entangled with each other and are very deeply interconnected and affect each other. So what really is entanglement? And I'm using this as a way of kind of leveraging in and looking at different kind of forms, which is really important. So, and is it useful to use that term to describe art and science? And also, why is culture so obsessed with talking about entanglement at the moment? When the science is actually nearly 100 years old. So the word entanglement first appeared in a letter in 1935 from Erwin Schrödinger, he of the cat fame on the left. And he wrote a letter to Albert Einstein in response to a paper which Albert Einstein had written. Albert had written it with his colleagues Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, and they had explored the concept, but they hadn't used the word. And they actually thought that entanglement, in fact, was impossible because it violated the local realism of causality. And it suggested that particles at different locations across time and space influence and affect each other, however far apart they are. And he discounted that. Although he did think that separate particles could have correlation. So Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance. And since then, actually, entanglement has actually been scientifically proven. So an entangled particle was sent to a spacecraft and into space and back, and remained entangled with a particle which was on Earth. That was in 2017. And most famously, the entanglement, this whole theory, has been given the ultimate accolade in 2022 with the award of the Nobel Prize for Physics to three scientists who are working for it: Alan Aspect, John F. Clauser, Anton Zeilinger, for their individual groundbreaking experiments, which demonstrated the actual potential to investigate and control particles that are in entangled states. So quantum physics, including entanglement, is now held up as one of the most accurate description of how nature actually works. And it was quite telling, though, that when I wrote the book Entangle, based on the exhibition I did in 2018 about the entanglement of artists and scientists together through physics, that the physicist Carlo Rovelli, who was one of the contributors, actually pushed back and didn't want to write about entanglement because he said it was practically impossible to describe it in words. And as the physicist Niels Bohr has said, if you understand quantum mechanics or think you do, then you obviously don't. And Niels Bohr also famously said that writing is actually a metaphor, and you can never really understand it because maths is the higher language and has a language which describes it better. But anyway, putting this all aside, entanglement has really taken off as a way of describing things interacting in our world. And one of the reasons is that it has gone into academic discourse. And academic discourse has a way of leaking out into society and then becoming popular, normally about 15, 10 years, sometimes later. And Karen Barad, who's a physicist turned philosopher, wrote the famous book now in 2007 called Meeting the Universe Halfway. And she described entanglement as to not simply be intertwined with one another, as in joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence, saying that existence is not an individual affair, and describing entanglement as being about intra-action rather than interaction. So intra-action with things just changing and having conversations with each other. And this really built also on the philosophy of vital materialism, with which Rosa Brodotti, for example, Donna Haraway's been involved with, but also Jane Bennett, showing that existence is not an independent affair, but equally sentience is not the privilege of just of human beings, that even things like rocks and stones have a different way of acting or being in the world, thanks to a certain degree to particles which unite us all and all are all part of physical particle physics. And I think this view is so popular because it's indicating an idea of equity between all beings, which is a wonderful and special thing to think about. And it has led to the breakdown, quite rightly, of anthropocentrism with the human being at the top and nature and everything else underneath, towards a much more circular way of looking at the world and a much more inclusive way of looking at the world. But does it herald a new era of equality, this whole idea? And I would argue it actually doesn't, and that entanglement and the popularization of it, even though it may hopefully indicate equity, it disguises something which is deeply rooted also within the way we approach knowledge and knowledge making, and also science. That is basically desperately the fact that, for example, these ideas are actually rooted in ancient wisdoms, in much older wisdoms, which are much more all-encompassing than science. And science has validated it in the last 100 years But more ancient wisdoms have always posited this, and you can see this, for example. I mean, the native thinker Leroy Littlebear describes the fact that the human brain is a station on the radio dial, parked in one spot. It is deaf to all the other stations. The animals, rocks, trees simultaneously broadcasting across the whole spectrum of sentience. And he's really indicating how basically Native American thinking and quantum physics have actually always been well, Native American thinking has predated quantum physics incredibly, and he initiated a series of talks which are really worth looking at the Phelps Institute in the USA with the physicist and friend David Bohm, which are really worth looking at, and they show how quantum physics is is new, and entanglement is new, but actually they're not. It's actually based on ancient wisdom, and science has just been used to prove it. And then many other books as well, which look at it, like the one called Blackfoot Physics, The Journey into the Native American Universe by David Peat. And if you also look up the works and writings of Kimberly Toolbear, who's professor and Canadian research chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Society at the University of Alberta, she discusses how ancient wisdoms and Indigenous cultures across the world have always had this incredible being, thinking, encountering, sensing, experiencing view of the world where everything is together and interacting, and this is part of everyday living. It's just that quantum physics in the last 80 years has said, oh, this is what it should be about. The very wonderful Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's founder and director of the Centre for Native Peoples and Environment, talks about how we can learn actually from other intelligences and other intelligences in life, and that sweetgrass, for example, is an intelligence which we can learn from. Moss, for example, is an intelligence we can learn from in terms of the way it occupies the world and has proven to be so resistant and resilient. And she also talks about, she says very clearly, what is it that has enabled them to persist for 350 million years through every kind of catastrophe, every climate change that's ever happened on this planet? And what may we learn from that? The lessons of being small, of giving more than you take, of working with natural law, sticking together. All the ways that they live, I just feel are really poignant teachings for us right now. And so this is kind of pointing towards the fact that we can be learning from other beings. And I think it's also striking that Professor Kimmerer uses science together with the indigenous wisdoms, which she is very, very versed in. And she mutually uses them as partners in her work. But what is really important, as I've kind of been outlining, is that to a certain degree, science has colonized the thinking of indigenous wisdoms. It said it didn't exist, it's discounted it until it proved it. And by science, I'm talking about a Western science, which is very, very based on the human eye, is based on also observation, and it dates from the Enlightenment. And to a certain degree, the eye has been a dominant force and a colonizing force, a kind of white colonizing force within the global economy and within the world, and a very imperialistic one, which is very linked also back to Descartes and the philosophy of the Enlightenment. I think, therefore I am. And I think the eye, the eye of the individual and the eye of the human eye, they are very controlling, discriminating, categorization, categorizing forces which have led to domination, oppression, and colonialism. And really, what we need to be doing is embracing all the senses, taste, touch, imagination, creativity, which I call a sense, as well as proprioception, and not just the eye. And Western Enlightenment actually banned these kind of different senses, which were part of alchemy, for example. And they banned it when they created the new methodology of science in the academies, which has leaked through into global culture. And they said it was irrational and basically wanted just observation as the kind of very controlling way of looking at the world and proving science, rather than thinking of all the other senses which alchemy, for example, used. And I think it's very telling that even when a white man has tried to bring in these ideas of a kind of sensuous, all-encompassing world like James Lovelock, that he actually got dismissed, particularly in the 80s and 90s, as completely crackpot and lunatic. And these ideas, again, were really those from ancient wisdoms, which he was just talking about, but they were dismissed. So I think it's really important when we're thinking of a new philosophy of interconnectionness and entanglement to show that we've actually just we have just copied what already exists in the world, and we've so-called validated it through science, which is to a certain degree been quite colonial, very colonial in the way it's looked at it. But the way forwards, and also we've been looking at the way forwards in the world of looking at new technologies as a way of observing the world. And new technologies also bring their own things to this party, because new technologies are not new. And that's a really important thing to say. It's a complete misnomer. Jussi Parikka, in his very groundbreaking book, A Geology of Media, shows how deeply the media which we rely on, whether it's our mobile phones, computers, or whatever, are totally due to deep time, due to the geology of the world and the earth we live in. So in a sense, they're old and they're the most ancient of things. So calling it new media is completely wrong. It kind of fetishizes innovation, which is not correct. And yet again, technology in a way is acting as a kind of oppressive and colonizing force, which is trying to control and take over the planet. And after all, how much do we know what exists inside our phones? Or our computers. If you look at, for example, idiom, which is one of the oxides which is inside a mobile phone, indium actually comes from the explosion of stars. And how can we replicate the explosion of stars over times? How can we do that? That's a very critical mineral, which is actually on the list of things which are happening. So technology is very, very linked with ecology. And this wonderful work by Kate Crawford with the designer Valden Yola called The Anatomy of an AI System very much shows how AI, or machine learning as it can be called, is so interconnected to the geology of the earth, and that cannot be discounted at all. And it really does a map of all the geology and the energy and resources which are used to power AI, which technology is being increasingly text kind of black boxed. And yet, when you look at it, it's so dependent on ecology. Ecology is totally central to it. And what is technology but the appliance of science? And so everything is very interconnected. Nothing can exist without ecology as well. And I would say ecology in art and science and technology, the most important thing of all is ecology, because without it, none of that would exist, nor would we. And it's very telling that one of the great kind of adopters of the art science movement in the late 90s, 80s, kind of turned away from appearing and talking about art and science. Bruno Latour, who was a French social scientist, turned away and said he wanted to talk about ecology, and he actually turned down talking about art and science in order to talk about ecology. So I'm kind of saying that ecology is the bedrock, and it has been squeezed out also of the art science discourse, art science and technology discourse, and needs to be firmly within it because it's the founding principle of everything. So what in all of this is the role of the art and the artist, and yeah, what is the role of that? And how, yeah, how does it disentangle everything? I think it does. And I'm not saying that art is innocent of being also part of the power structures of oppression and control. I'm not saying that. That's for another discussion in another paper. But what I am saying is that there is an incredible role which is there to a certain degree in the 21st century. I think we're now seeing that artists are now the new freedom fighters, the truth seekers. They are radical agents. And I love the word radical agents because radical comes from radix, from root. They're Imagineers because imagining beyond is so important and is a human superpower. And I think you can look at 3 exhibitions or 3 artists just as a way of showing how we can have a new way forward. So Critical Zones was one of the last exhibitions by Peter Weibel with Bruno Latour at ZKM in Germany, which is a special technological center and gallery. And Critical Zones was a massive exhibition, which was also online during COVID. And the term critical zones, which they use, is really important because, as they were saying, it breaks down the cartographical view of the planet Earth. And cartography is very much based on the eye and mapping and exploring, and replaces it by actually saying that there are these different zones, and we need to get away from the professional disease of looking too long at physical globes or clicking too often on digital maps, which causes people to end up believing that because data are projected on a sphere, they are for this reason, as if by a magic wand, unified, continuous, and homogeneous, which they're not. Everything is so different. The local is so different, and we need to remember the local. And the exhibition had an observatory right at the head of it, at the center of it, which was linked to a real-time outside observatory in the Black Forest, and was beaming inwards and outwards to each other, which I thought was very extraordinary. It was kind of showing that even though it was using the idea of observing and observatories, it was also showing that observation is complex and diffuse, and there are different ways of doing it, from the sensual to the scientific to the artistic to the audience to the responsive. It's not a one-way system. Equally, it said, we do not only live on the earth, but from the earth. And by doing so, we're changing the earth. And I think that's really critical, because in everything we do, we should be responding to how are we changing the earth? What are we doing? Are we extracting, oppressing, and dominating it? And the exhibition was all about establishing a feedback between what we are doing to the soil we live on and how the soil reacts to our collective action. This mode of inquiry is to sense the critical zone through a set of different senses, and to develop an alternative sensorium, including our own actions, to which the critical zones is sensitive to. And that is at the center of the exhibition. One of the artists also in the exhibition was the artist Julian Charrier, and he created this installation called Future Fossil Spaces, which is an extraordinary piece which is made from it's kind of towers of salt, which are from lithium brine from the Salar Uyuni in Chile. Now, the Salar Uyuni in Chile, the desert, it's one of the world's largest salt flats, is being totally exploited. And this work is a warning of how this area is also the home of, as yet, unexploited precious element, that of lithium, which is so essential to our technology. The title, Future Fossil Spaces, actually refers to the future negative spaces that will be carved in the earth by lithium mining operations. And like all great art, the installation effectively enables us both to think, inquire, explore as to what it's about, and feel about how the enlargement of the virtual world requires a hollowing out of the natural world and of natural resources. Another approach, the second approach, is the 23rd Biennale of Sydney in 2022, which is an extraordinary biennale called Rivers, as in river, as in wetlands. And it was very much placing rivers, wetlands, and other salt and freshwater ecosystems as both the subject and the object of this huge biennale, which was held at the Museum of Contemporary Art. It was very, very notable because the river was, I mean, rivers are so important. They're givers of life and they're routes of communication and places of ritual, but they've also been co-opted as natural avenues for colonial enterprise, becoming sites of violent conflict and oppression and exploitation. And it's interesting that the Latin root of rivus, which means a brook or a stream, is also the origin of the word rivalry, which is interesting. Now, this extensive exhibition was very noticeable because at the entrance of each exhibition, a different river greeted the audience. Its cultural significance and its ecological challenges were embodied by a First Nations custodian narrator. And the works were very much looking at different aspects of the river, of the different kind of whether it was from creating work and living and being on the river, as well as looking at things like the personhood of the river, because as you know, recently animals, plants, mountains, and bodies of water have been granted legal personhood. But if we recognize them as individual beings, what might they say was one of the questions. And also one of the questions is, why should we have this kind of legal framework, which has again come from the Enlightenment, to why should we be using that when older wisdoms themselves have always recognized beings and existences in nature as having their own rightness. So why should there be the need of rights? That is a question which this raises. Thirdly, I'd like to draw attention to an exhibition called Pulling Blood from a Stone by the artist Neve Schmidtke, who's a Swedish-Irish artist, and she was paired with a geologist at Technical University of Berlin as part of the Science Gallery International program. And she was interesting because she very much uses different senses to engage with the work and the trauma of, for example, geology. And a piece she did there was housed in this extraordinary structure, which was painted by the minerals, which were actually featured in a radio play which you can't hear, but hopefully you'll get the slide and you'll be able to click on this link and you'll be able to hear it. In which minerals spoke their truth about what had happened within the background of time to them from billions of years ago when they first formed in deep time to way out into the future when they mount a rebellion against humankind. And this radio play incorporated imagination and vocalization of different minerals expressing their wishes. And okay, you can say it's anthropomorphism, but equally, Neve wanted to really have a way of connecting with human beings so they could understand or perhaps imagine what the trauma and exploitation of stones and rocks within our society and the way we've kind of disregarded them. So she used the sense of smell because you can smell the pigments, you can touch these, you can touch rocks within the installation. Also hearing because of the radio play, which also had a sound bed connected with it. Didn't incorporate taste, but it did incorporate touch. And other parts of this exhibition, they also made it very, very clear that they too were implicated in the exploitation of minerals. And these reused mobile phones in which they have reflections about their life as they travel through different landscapes on trains, which are so-called green, but they are reflecting on the fact that they too are implicated and there's no escape from it. So it's also showing the artist as responsive, as also careful, and I would say the structure which they used for the radio play was actually due to the students they were working with saying very clearly that they were so traumatized by climate change and the oppression which was linked with it, that they needed a safe space. So this enclosed space was a response to the audience who when they listen to the play may be moved. So their emotions are held within the space. And right at the back of the exhibition was a film, a very straight documentary film about the exploitation of Namibia and how the first genocide of the 20th century actually occurred in Namibia through German exploitation of mining of minerals. And this was a very hard-hitting kind of documentary. So yes, and many people died during that extraordinary genocide in Sumep. And that again was about colonialism and extraction. So this leads us to a point which Timothy Morton has said in his book. He says all art is ecological, and it's ecological, I think, because it links us back to the working of nature by appealing to all our senses, imaginations and intuitions. It involves and is not afraid of the ineffable, the undreamt of, unfelt, unspoken, the unthought of, the inexplicable and strange, and also touching us in a way which sometimes we can't explain. So like being in Julian's installation, you can't really explain it to a certain degree. You have to read up about it, but when you're in it, you're very moved and you have a sense of something bigger and beyond yourself. And I also think art is also a portal back into ancient wisdoms and indigenous knowing, because it appeals to all of us, all our senses, imaginations and intuitions. It's not closing us off. So it's a portal back to that and to nature. But entanglement, to a certain degree, can be a not useful way of looking at things because it kind of devolves human beings of responsibility in a way? If we say everything's interconnected and everything's talking to each other, where is the human in that? And the Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar, with his colleagues Michel Osterval and Kriti Sharma, have kind of addressed this question of entanglement, but also human responsibility, and come up with an idea of relationality, an emergence politics of life beyond the human, as a way of putting and making the human being responsible. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at things. How do we move from non-relational, which to relational living and world making? How do we interrupt the active production of non-relationality by patriarchal, colonial, capitalist social orders? How do we build on the ongoing political activation of relationality? And as they say, our book is an invitation to everyone to discover the awesome potential of acting from interdependence and care in tandem with myriad struggles and experiments engaged in redesigning life, politics, and the human towards more livable and pluriversal futures. And I think whilst we live in a world in which humans exist, this is a very important contribution, which, as I said, combines entanglement, the ideas of entanglement, but makes the responsibility back to the human. You could say that's anthropocentric, but on the other hand, we do have a responsibility, and human beings are having the greatest effect and impact on the planet. So we have to accept that rather than push back against it. So what I've done is I've disentangled a bit entanglement. I've looked at the way it's a culturally popular term. It's a term from quantum physics. I've disentangled the power dynamics and colonialism within it, and within art, science, and technology and ecology, just a little bit, and how ecology has been pushed out very much and dominated, and how it can be a useful term in terms of colloquial terms, saying we're connected, but unhelpful because it devolves the human of responsibility. So there's a kind of argument regarding that. Yes, but equally, it leads us towards a new ecology of being in which there's relationality, which includes entanglement, in which the human being is responding and being part of art, science, technology, and ecology, and responding with care, attention, with questions, not accepting orthodoxies per se, like orthodoxies of science, but also thinking about how there may be older wisdoms underneath, which we need to discover and find and recognize and acknowledge. And I think until the human need for power, control, domination, and capital disappears, which is now finding refuge, I think, very much in the black boxing of technology. So populations don't even know, let alone understand, how technology works. Until that's eradicated, the real entanglement of quantum physics, of things interacting together, of a kind of equity, that can't happen. That endless universe of reciprocity and interchange will remain forever a distant dream. But what we can do is relationality. So that's the end of my talk.